Welcome back to day 3 of the Smart Protein Summit. On day 1 and day 2, we focused on talking about the state of the industry in the plant-based and broader smart protein space. We've talked about building out a roadmap for the future in terms of how we can create national plans, work on talent development, policy involvement, as well as industry coming together to scale a supply chain and really build an industry over the next 10 years. And today on day 3, we're talking about intersections with public and planetary health, especially as we've had over the last several days, the Conference of Parties, the Global Conference of Parties 26, the most important climate conference in the world, as well as earlier this year, the UN Food System Summit, and a whole host of interest, a whole laser focus this year on food systems as a lever of change as we move forward through the next decades. This is a particularly opportune time to have this conversation. And kicking off this day 3, I'm delighted to have with us a keynote speaker who can speak to all of these issues, particularly nutrition, a challenge that we face in India and that essentially threatens our population's ability to shape its destiny over the next decades. I'm not going to spend time going through the entire bio of Mrs. Vinita Bali because I think that could take up the entirety of this session. She's a bit of a legend in the Indian corporate landscape. She led Brittania, which is one of our most important and large corporations, for a very long time as both MD and CEO. And then she's also had something of a second career as a nutrition leader and convener. She currently heads the Confederation of Indian Industries National Committee on Nutrition and has been an extremely important voice bringing corporate leaders together to drive nutrition status forward. So without further ado, let me introduce Mrs. Vinita Bali. Thank you so much, Vinita, for joining us.
Thank you, Varun. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, so let's jump right into it, Vinita. As we've discussed, the alternative protein or the smart protein sector is taking off globally, but it's still taking its first steps here in India. We've got dozens of companies started. We're working with them on product development, go-to-market, distribution, etc. But I want to ask you about innovation with a corporate lens. Sometimes there can be a disconnect between innovation and scale, particularly due to cost, right, or distribution. We've seen the large food ecosystem globally take to these categories very enthusiastically. They see them as a major growth opportunity, sustainability win, etc. But what excites you personally about innovation and corporate innovation?
So, Varun, I think innovation is a word that is used very freely by everybody. So I think the first important thing is to really create a definition for innovation that gets us all on the same page. I've thought about this and, in my several years of work, etc., the simplest way I can describe innovation is to do something that is capable of adding new value on an ongoing and sustainable basis. In other words, if I create a new process for doing something that adds, that reduces my cost and therefore increases my profitability, that is also an innovation. Typically, when we talk about innovation, most mindsets are around product and packaging innovation. How will the product I develop be better than the products that are already available to consumers? And what is that unique advantage that my product or my packaging is going to bring to the consumer? I think another thing to remember as far as innovation or frankly the basics of marketing are concerned is that I may think that I have a very unique product, but if there is no relevance of that product in the consumer's life, I can be highly unique and differentiated, but if I'm not relevant, nobody is going to buy me. On the other hand, the corollary is also true. If I'm relevant, but there are many choices available to consumers, then it's very hard for me to make myself distinctive and therefore, create a preference for the brand that I'm selling. So we have to be very mindful of when we talk about innovation, who are we adding value to? What is the relevance of that product or packaging or solution to the consumer? And how distinctive it is from everything else that is available. You talked about scale. Scale comes from nothing but relevance and a really, a price that really communicates value at that price point. So let's take a very specific example. We've talked about, and this is a great way to think about it in the context of another industry. Take the automobile industry. Till Tesla came and disrupted that industry with EVs, there are large companies, big global brands that have been in this market for a long time. Did they not know how to do an EV? Of course they did. But it took an outsider like Tesla to come and disrupt the market. Now, Tesla sells more expensive than any other car. Of course, it sells many less cars as well. But it has actually given consumers a very compelling and a very relevant reason to buy their product. And they are charging a price for it, which the consumer is willing to pay. I think for all products, relevance, differentiation, and value to the consumer are the key tenets of innovation.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I actually asked, I want to get into the flip side of that question. I asked this second question of Mr. Siraj Chaudhary of Cargill as well yesterday. Look, internationally, the Tesla example is great because internationally, companies like Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods have catalyzed an entire industry. They've pulled in the other large corporations. So traditional food and meat players, 9 out of the top 10 US meat producers now have their own line of plant-based meats, or they've invested in plant-based meats, right? But Tesla's at the top end of the market, and a lot of these products are at the top end of the market, whereas Indian corporations, and even speaking more generally about the global south, corporations in the developing world are operating in an entirely different context. A lot of the companies that we work with across the landscape, they have their innovation centers in Switzerland or Singapore or the US, but the Indian leadership has a whole different set of pressures and priorities. So what would you be able to say about the capabilities of Indian large corporations to be able to enter this space, which we think is a key piece of it being established in the Indian market?
So, Varun, I think we have to be very clear about what is this space and what works for the US or Western Europe may or may not work in its entirety in India. So what do I mean by that? Yes, there are companies like Beyond Meat and several others that have created a disruption, etc. But we cannot also forget that if you look at the per capita consumption of whatever it is, non-vegetarian products, pork, beef, chicken, poultry, etc., and compare what the Americans have as per capita consumption or what Europe has compared with India, I mean, we're a minuscule proportion of that. So when you think about food from a planet perspective, anybody in the food industry will tell you that we grow food for 3 reasons. Food is food for people, food as feed for livestock. A lot of the world's soya and corn, etc., goes to feed, pigs and cattle, which are then slaughtered for beef and pork. And then there is food for fuel. And what does it cost to grow this food? Plant-based proteins in a context of a very high consumption of, beef and, pork and chicken and all of those things is very different to plant-based protein in the context of the Indian palate. And if you think about the Indian palate amongst the vegetarians, there is in any case a lot of plant-based protein. We have our chanas and we have our paneer and so on. So I think we have to, first of all, contextually understand and say, why does plant-based protein, which is actually substituting animal protein, why is that relevant for India? And if it is relevant for India, what is the best way of addressing that market? And the best way of addressing that market also then takes into account that this is not going to end up being yet another product for the elite few. But, can we do it at a scale? You talked about scale in innovation. Can we do it at a scale that actually gets protein across to people in imaginative ways, using a combination of plant-based and animal-based protein, or a mix of the two, which is affordable and accessible for people in India?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, Vinita. And I think bringing in the concept of nutrition, I think I really want to stay with that and dive deeper into that for a second here. We have these almost two simultaneous, almost competing propositions in India. We have, as you said, we are actually not getting enough nutrients, right? Many people would argue animal sourced foods are a great nutrient dense way to get nutrients out to the population, micronutrients, protein, etc. Right? We're not eating that much of it. So we have this. You mentioned there's a lot of plant proteins, but we do have a huge problem of undernutrition, right? So much of our protein is currently being got from cereals, which makes no sense, right? We have these indigenous crops that we should be leveraging a lot more. On the other hand, the growth in demand for aspirational foods like animal sourced foods over the next decade will place tremendous burdens on us. In fact, if you look at the aggregate numbers now, we are definitely up there, even though the per capita consumption is lower. We eat much more meat than Australia, which is a very red-blooded meat-eating country. It just is what it is because of our population, right? And most of those impacts are going to be felt locally, water scarcity, etc. So we have these competing propositions. It's all set against the backdrop, as I said, of undernutrition. So could you frame for the audience, what is our problem? Why are we in a nutrition emergency for the next decades?
So we have been a country which has been undernourished for a very, very long time. In fact, ever since we started gathering this data based on the NFHS studies or the nutrition indices that are put out from time to time, or other such studies that look at consumption of food in India. So we have 3 or 4 kinds of challenges to address. The first and the simplest is that there are just many people in India. When I'm talking about many, I'm talking about hundreds of millions who don't get enough calories to eat every day. In fact, the last FAO report that was put out said out of a total of something like 850 to 900 million people who kind of sleep hungry every day, which means they never get enough calories on any day, nearly 200 million live in India. Now, there's enough talk that is happening now which says that the pandemic, if anything, has made this worse, not better, for a lot of Indians. So one problem we have is sheer hunger, which is less calories. And when I'm talking about calories, I'm talking about the macronutrients, which is your fats, your cereals, proteins, etc. The second issue then is that, because of not enough calories, obviously there is not enough micronutrients that these people are getting. And micronutrients, very simply, are your vitamins and minerals. So all of us, for healthy, nutritious eating, need both macronutrients as well as micronutrients, and a very diversified source of each of these, from fruits to vegetables to plant-based products to animal-based products, what have you. So that's the second issue. The third issue is that there are people in India who are not calorie deficient, but they're nutrition deficient. In other words, we see around us people who are fat, people who are obese, who are eating too many calories, but they're eating too many of the wrong calories and not getting enough vitamins and minerals. So there are people with low calories and low nutrition, people with okay calories, but still low nutrition in terms of the micronutrients, and people with excessive calories and low nutrition. So each of these poses a very big challenge. If you juxtapose on this, what is the price of nutritious food? What is the cost of nutritious food? I think that also becomes a very important factor. A lot of times people are eating food that fills my stomach, but is not good for me. So that's largely carbs. I mean, the Indian diet is very high in carbs because, on a per rupee basis, carbs are actually cheaper. 200 grams of rice will fill my stomach a lot more than trying to eat the same quantity by way of fruit or vegetable or salad. So I think understanding context then becomes very important. Yes, in the absolute, because of our 1.4 billion population, as we keep saying, for everything, even if everybody consumes a little, it'll add up to a lot. But I think what we have to look here is this cannot be a macro solution. It has to be a solution which is segmented. Yes, there are people in India who are watching their diets, who are watching, what they eat, how they eat, where they eat, and are willing to pay and can afford to pay a lot more. So, perhaps plant-based proteins from their point of view, if they're going to be more expensive, make a lot of sense versus, someone who's just barely earning enough to make two ends meet. And unless the price of these so-called plant-based proteins is at a level where it becomes hugely affordable, I think we are not really facing the truth front on. And we have to therefore say, what are the other sources of relatively cheaper plant-based proteins in our diet? We've started talking about millets a lot. So millets, much better than having, grains like rice or wheat. There are peanuts. There are a lot of things as part of the Indian diet that I think, as part of this whole cycle of innovation, I think one thing is to take inspiration from what is happening in the West. The other thing clearly is to take inspiration from what our grandmother diets used to be and how they ate.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that all makes a lot of sense, especially. So I think we need to segment the market. There is that top end of the market, which is people who've seen the Game Changers documentary. They're already eating meat 10 times a week. That's the early adopter market. They can afford to spend. But I mean, if we want to transcend that early adopter market to the true mass market, we need to contextualize and we need to behave intelligently in that sense. I guess what we are saying is that given that we are in an emergency, we definitely are in a climate emergency. We are currently, I hope, emerging from one of the most significant public health emergency in 150 years. And we don't really have time to wait, right? In terms of if we want to contextualize for the developing world, that means installing infrastructure, supply chain, talent pools, regulation, all of that now, because we can't look out to 2030 and in 2030 look back and say, well, now what? We wish we had done this, right? So I guess my question for you is, we think we need to go mission mode on this in terms of creating that supply chain and building what the likes of Canada are doing. They're saying they want to be the protein farmers for the rest of the world and create huge industries and jobs. Now, whether that protein goes into snacks or meat substitutes or whatever, we think that we need to go mission mode and focus on things that are important for India. So if the West is focusing purely on replicating the taste of meat, we need to additionally add in the nutrition component and the cost component immediately. So from your perspective, because you brought people together on a mission for nutrition, what do you think comes first? A little bit of demonstration of market or people going mission mode first? Because we don't want to be stuck here for the next 2, 3, 5 years before people start working on this.
So Varun, I think what you've outlined is a very large agenda. And it's an agenda that involves several players. It's about what we grow. It's about what comes to the market. For the nutrition community, we for the longest time have really been saying that we have to increase people's access to nutritious foods. Now, again, in India, what is true of one segment may or may not be, is definitely not true of another segment. There are people who are eating, they've got a good diet of fruit and vegetables and proteins and, the right amount of fats and so on. And there are others to whom even the basics are not available. So I think the first thing really is, how do we look at food? How do we look at nutrition and food together? It's no longer about assuaging hunger. It is about wellness. It is about building immunity. One thing that this pandemic brought to the front of everybody's reckoning was the fact that in order to have a good immune system, I have to go back and think about the food I'm eating or the lifestyle I have, and the lifestyle I have, not or the lifestyle I have. So I think the action has to be, and yes, it has to be mission mode, because there are two things coming together simultaneously. On the one hand, there are all these climate disruptions. And there is a recent report out which talks about the cost of climate-induced disasters, whether these are cyclones or floods and so on. And the cost to India last year is $86 billion. Now, I would rather see these $86 billion invested in creating good supply chains for food, in increasing the access to nutritious food for all people of India, not to some of the people of India. And in that context, there will be a place for substitutes from animal protein to plant protein for people. But I think to imagine an India which is going to move completely to plant-based protein is actually not practical. It's not practical in the West either. I think it'll have to be over a period of time. People also have to realize the role that they are playing in not just their own health, but also the health of the planet. And most importantly, to understand that the planet's health and my health are intertwined.
Yeah, great points. And somewhat analogous to renewables, because we're reaching tipping points in renewable energies now. I mean, last year, renewables absorbed about 500 billion with a B in investment globally, and that includes 32 billion with a B of public R&D innovation money, right? So I think that you're right that envisioning a wholesale shift, or in India, a leapfrogging of animal meat directly to a plant-based meat or whatever, is a very difficult thing to see now. But we definitely sorry, go ahead, please.
No, Varun, I was thinking as you were talking, I think how we frame the question becomes very important. If we say we've got to move from animal-based protein to plant-based protein, then, the actions will be very different. If, on the other hand, we approach this whole thing saying, how do we increase affordable nutrition in India whilst being responsible to the environment, whilst being responsible to good farming practices, so that if I'm growing food, most of that food is for food and not for feed, which then gets converted into animal-based protein. So I think the questions have to be extremely clear. And I think if we start with the notion of what are all the initiatives that we need to take to increase the quantity, quality, and frequency of nutritious food for the people of India, then plant-based proteins will have a role to play, as will other things like how do I increase the productivity of vegetables and fruit that I'm growing in India? Why does fruit have to be so expensive? Why does fruit have to grow near the city centers and come into the cities to be consumed? And why is it not being consumed in the villages? So I think it's a much bigger question. And I think all of us have to ask this question, which is, how do we improve the access to nutritious food?
Yeah, it's a great question. Someone on day one, we also had someone bring up the excellent point. One way to frame this category is don't say why it's not bad, say why it's good. Mm-hmm. And that usually works to rally people around a cause a little bit better than coming out in opposition of something else. And yeah. I think that makes total sense.
Yeah, and there are the flip sides of the coin, which is that this is good for me from a nutrition point of view and so on. And anyway, I think we're repeating ourselves. But yes, I think you have to give people a reason why something is better for them.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
Or good for them.
Yeah, and I agree 100%. And, we think, as you've said, we think this is an essential bow in the quiver, right? This is an essential part of a bouquet of interventions that need to be undertaken to improve a lot of things: nutritional mm-hmm. status, climate resilience, even economic growth, as many mm-hmm. other countries are doing: Singapore, Netherlands, Israel, Canada, etc. Let me end with a question about the future, because you've been, over many decades in industry as well as now a convener of industry. You have created a lot of growth in different directions that are positive for nutrition status, etc. And so I wanted to ask you a question about the future. You've hinted at this over the course of this conversation, but what would you say are our best bets, our most promising opportunities to improve nutritional status at all levels of the socioeconomic pyramid? And where does something like smart protein or plant-based protein fit into that? And if there's no silver bullet, I'm totally happy for you to say there's no silver bullet, because I think people expect a silver bullet.
Yeah, Varun, that's a very broad-based and very expansive question. And yes, there is no silver bullet. There is a lot of hard work in many domains simultaneously, because what we are really talking about is a complex, nutrition is in and of itself complex, in the sense that it's not just about food. Nutrition is about food. It is about access to potable water. It is about access to sanitation and hygiene. It is about access to very good primary health care, in addition to having access to nutritious food. So action has to take place in each of these domains simultaneously. Of course, each of us ends up doing what we are good at. The work that you are pioneering, the work that a lot of other companies are doing, not just around the world, but also in India, is very important, because the challenges that we are solving for is a population of 1.4 billion people that by any stretch of imagination is really not healthy or doesn't get enough nutritious food. Look at the status of women in India, look at the status of children in India, and the general population in India. We've got a healthcare industry, which in some ways, is really the sick care industry and is bigger than the food industry, primarily because of the health-related issues that we have. A lot of those caused by undernutrition, low immunity, etc. So I think the work that you are doing in pioneering, whether it is looking at new sources of proteins that are going to be environmentally better, as well as better from a health point of view as far as people are concerned. So these innovations must happen. These innovations are absolutely necessary, because the way to address these issues is to look at improving productivity of agriculture. And when I'm using the word agriculture, I'm saying everything we grow, fruits, vegetables, cereals, etc. The second thing that we are really saying is to do so in a manner where the cost actually comes down, and therefore what we produce becomes more accessible, more affordable to many more people. The third thing we are saying is using science and technology to improve that which we have. And that ranges all the way from fortification to biofortification to plant-based proteins and so on. The fourth is really to do all of this with a lens of saying, if it is not capable of getting to the masses, it is unlikely to cause a significant shift in a country like India.
Vinita, thank you so much for sharing your experience, your wisdom, and your support at the Smart Protein Summit. We really appreciate your joining us.
Thank you. All the best. The work you're doing is great. So, we need all of this work in addition to everything else that is happening. So, my very best to you. Thank you.